So good morning, everybody. And if you noticed, by the way, Anson, I gave you a very clear berth there to get past me, which is exactly what I would do if I made you on a rugby pitch. Okay, so let me start by thanking the French Chamber for putting on this event. This is actually the third year now that I joined. The first that I've joined as a speaker, and having been invited as a speaker, it gave me the opportunity to have just a little glimpse of the hard work and preparation which they put into this to put in such a good event. I'm invited to many events throughout the years, most of which I politely decline, but this one I've always found to be very interesting, so I'm delighted to have the opportunity to present to you something today which I hope will also be interesting for you. Okay, so originally when the Chamber suggested to me to make a presentation, they suggested talking about economic crisis and how sourcing models will need to change. And I don't know if I'm an optimist, but I felt that to talk about economic crisis at the moment perhaps is not truly reflective of what we experience in the world. There's a lot of cases where we see economies now which are showing robust improvement. We have the United States Dow Jones with a record this last week. We have the UK FTSE with a high of the last 5 years. So instead of talking about economic crisis, I prefer to talk about economic change, and with a little focus coming from a sourcing background of how sourcing parts of businesses can drive innovation, and with a particular focus on co-development. So I've broken today into 5 main parts. Firstly, I'll talk a little bit about me and my background, then about the current business landscape, then I'll zoom in on co-development and innovation. I'll talk about how purchasing functions can contribute in this arena and proactively lead, and then close with some summary and conclusions. Okay, so about me. I'm English, as Anson has mentioned. I'm working in a French company, so I'm sure you can think of some good jokes about that at some point. By the way, I have spent 4.5 years in a French company. I'm yet to hear a good joke. I spent 15 years in an English business called GET, and we were an electrical design and manufacturer, 10 years of which I was the purchasing and product development director. And through that business, we became completely an outsourced model. So by default, everything we did was working in collaboration with partners, the majority of which were coming from China, but we also had partners throughout India, the rest of Asia, and also in Eastern Europe. Then in 2006, GET was acquired by Schneider. I spent the first couple of years in the UK handling the transition of that business into Schneider. And then in 2008 I moved to Hong Kong, which is where I live today. And I'm Vice President for the International Sourcing and our partner business. And within this function we're responsible for the sourcing, purchasing, project management, technical management and quality management. Also with a kind of offer marketing hat. The mission is about enriching our offers, driving innovation and technologies through co-developments with partners. A little bit about Schneider Electric. So Schneider is a global specialist in energy management. We provide energy and automation solutions across diversified end markets, making energy safe, reliable, efficient, sustainable and green. Sales of 24 billion euros in the last 12 months, with a healthy growth into new economies, 140,000 workers, heavy investment into R&D. We have approximately 100 or over 100 factories worldwide, and you see there in our sales with balanced sales across different geographies. I like this page because I'm going to be talking about innovation today and the ecosystem. And this is something from just a typical Schneider slide, and it talks about how we operate in the ecosystem. So partnering with various best-in-class public and private organisations. We lead global projects, for example, on intelligent buildings. We boost standardisation. We're a member, for example, of the Zigbee Wireless Alliance. And we also have a venture capital fund for investing into startups. 9,000 R&D engineers in 70 sites across over 20 countries. So the current landscape, where are we? It is certainly it's an inconsistent business climate. Some regions we experience are still slow. Many regions are actually showing positive and really exciting, robust growth. We have inconsistency within different business types across different regions. We face a continued resource scarcity of raw materials. Our projections I believe we're going to continue to see scarcity, and we're going to continue to see rising raw materials over the coming years, not only impacting price but also availability and supply chain. The China labour market, we experience a continued increase. We expect that to continue significantly, and the long-term projections we believe for currency will be continued appreciation. So what does this mean? Products which are coming from China, we would expect to face cost inflationary pressures. Okay. The business expectations from purchasing functions, I saw a report recently that still 70% of number one priorities amongst businesses is for cost reduction contribution from purchasing functions. So cost and competitive remains our number one priority. In addition to that, I call it the normal bread and butter requirements, such as supply performance, our cash management, quality, delivery, service, cost and inventory management. Purchasing functions will also be expected to lead the rebalancing and localisation of manufacturing and supply, particularly a move from the West through to Asia. We're probably seeing a little bit of change in that recently, where we're also manufacturing closer to our end markets, but I think the general swing is still from high-cost countries through to low-cost countries. Now, in addition to these bread and butter expectations from purchasing organisations, I talk also about a desire for purchasing functions to be more strategic. And what do we mean when we say more strategic? Clearly it means having a vision of what we want to be doing, and also a vision of what we don't want to be doing. So what I've focused on for today is one area that certainly meets a strategic desire within businesses, which is leading co-development with suppliers, and in doing so bringing innovation into our businesses. So what do we mean by co-development? There's many different ways of co-developing with partners, and I've listed some of these here, as you see. It could be on R&D, research and development, specific technologies. It could be through purchasing or manufacturing, and even within there you have a granular level, component level, components, part assemblies, technology bricks, or even buying finished goods. I know we have a wide selection of companies here today which are probably doing a combination of those. There could be brand label, or more detailed OEM and ODM subcontracting agreements, supply chain channels, not to be underestimated. I read only recently how I think the UK is only ever 2 weeks away of being completely out of food. So if there was a major supply chain hiccup in the supply chains of the UK, it would only take 2 weeks, and then they estimate 3 days to have complete anarchy. So never to be underestimated. Financial models, strategic alliances, different ways to market, and then also the business ecosystem. And I'm going to explain a little bit more about the ecosystem as we go on, but basically it's the interdependencies that when we bring a product to the market, that we work with other complementary developers, partners, competitors and users, which affect the value chain and success of your product. Now, when we look at co-development, this is an area for sourcing functions to take the lead in bringing innovation into our businesses. So the questions I ask is, who leads the innovation and co-development in your organisation? How are you set up? And is your purchasing function one of the key actors and contributors in this role? Or are you more of a secondary and reactive type of organisation? My belief is that sourcing businesses should be very proactive, and in order to do so, we need to refine our skills. We need strong sourcing, product and commercial skills. I use a phrase here called line of sight, and I like this phrase because it talks of, there's many dimensions when we talk about the line of sight. It's really understanding your business, your markets, your products, your competitors and the different suppliers and technologies. And then you can consider what is the best purchasing structure, and depending on the type of business, there will clearly be different types of purchasing organisations that you would have, whether it's local or global sourcing. Personally, I like an organisation that sourcing is not just purchasing itself. I kind of like the idea of a sourcing office, which includes also project management and technical and quality management. I'm going to focus today on product innovation, which kind of crosses over the purchasing and sourcing realms, and two different types. Firstly, groundbreaking, disruptive innovation, and I'll talk about the early movers advantage versus the higher risks when you bring through something which is disruptive, and also incremental innovation, which can be smaller measures but bringing through competitiveness, aesthetic designs, features and even different types of packaging. And sourcing functions can tap into both of these different types of technologies into your company. One of the debates, if you're a manufacturer, is how do you develop and bring a product to the market? Do you develop it completely yourselves, or do you look for co-development? And I think in today's arena, it is accepted by most manufacturers that we cannot do everything ourselves in-house. But you still need to be able to decide when you do have an R&D and manufacturing competence, what do you make and what do you buy? What do you develop and what do you co-develop? These are the sorts of questions that I believe will help form that decision. So first of all, you can consider the breadth of your R&D resources, competencies and capacity. Also the breadth of your manufacturing competencies and capacity. Now, getting key actors within your business to make agreement can be quite a challenge. You'll face people from your R&D, your manufacturing, industrialisation, purchasing, strategy. And I would recommend using some form of buy or make decision tree, where you'll look at the levels of priority of the type of product that you're looking to make. Is it core or is it not? Is it an area that you have your competencies, or is it something that you would be better to bring to market through partnerships? And if you are going to then co-develop, these are things that I think you should consider. What is the value proposition of your partner? Taking into account those points that I've just raised above. Ensuring that you have clear IP protection. One of the concerns that manufacturers especially have when you co-develop is about your intellectual property. So having clarity and contractual agreements with your suppliers on IP is critical. Understanding the deliverables and the delivery risk. I think a lot of companies may underestimate the deliverables and risks when you co-develop. You can delegate effectively, but you cannot abdicate, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. Considering the speed to market, your project costs, the technical bandwidth within your business and also your partners, and it could be multiple partners. And also to ensure that you have the right skills and mindset in your co-development team. Co-developing projects is a different experience to developing a project purely internally in your business. And a lot of that is experience, but it's also the mindset of your group. I now talk about two potential pitfalls when we work on co-development. There's been a lot of good work in this area by a professor called Ron Adler. I'd recommend, if anyone is interested, there's a great book called The Wide Lens, and I've taken 2 examples from there and tried to also apply it to some of my experiences. So the first one is about underestimating the delivery risks and percentages when we co-develop, and the second one is about understanding the ecosystem. So I've explained that the ecosystem is the network of interdependencies involving other developers, partners and users when you bring through some disruptive innovation. When you do bring through something disruptive, it can affect the ecosystem, not least where new actors and other players come into the market, which can affect the success of your product. So just having a great innovation alone is not always enough. We need to have a strong strategy and understanding and execution of that ecosystem. So the co-development delivery risk. I'd like you to imagine a scenario. You are a manufacturer, say, and you want to bring through a new product that requires 4 different critical technologies. And you want to consider what your options are. You could either develop completely in-house, or you could go through co-development. So you would like to consider what are the real risks and benefits of both. You should follow some form of make or buy decision tree, as I've explained, and that the purchasing function has a critical role in this, in the partner selection and making the deal and understanding their value proposition. So what is the real risk when we do this form of co-development, and how do we actually calculate and manage these percentages? So the scenario I give here is, imagine that you are one of the 4 companies making these 4 critical technologies. So you're working with 3 partners, and each one of you has an 85% chance of success in the technology that you're looking to develop. Okay? And just accept that the 85% is correct at the moment. Obviously, it could be different. So what is the chance of success in this type of project? And it's surprising, even in our own business, the type of answers that we get. A lot of people would assume it is still at 85%, but it really doesn't work that way. And I use the scenario here of the dice. If you're throwing a dice and you want to have the number 6, you have a 1 in 6 chance. And if someone next to you is also rolling a dice and they also want to have a 6, they also have a 1 in 6 chance. But the chance of you both throwing a 6 becomes 1 in 36 chance. And this is the point. If you all have an 85% chance, when you multiply those through, you actually have a 52% chance of success. So it's important to understand and not underestimate still the delivery risks when we co-develop. It's not a given it would be delivered when you consider all those technologies to bring through. And then you need to consider, how will that affect your decision? And even with a 52% chance, we may well continue to go ahead with that if the spoils and the benefits of that far away outweigh that risk. So I hope that makes sense. Now I'll talk about another potential pitfall when we talk about innovation. It's about the ecosystem. And this is not really specifically about purchasing or sourcing. This is a general point, particularly about groundbreaking, disruptive innovation, which quite often does affect the ecosystem, whereby you can have new stakeholders which will impact your route to market and success through the value chain. So how does the ecosystem actually affect us? Obvious cases: cars need roads and petrol stations. There is an ecosystem. Lighting needs electrical grids. When we bring through some groundbreaking, disruptive innovation, sometimes the ecosystem is not so obvious, especially at the outset. And I've given a few examples here. Michelin run flat tyres, which I'll talk about in the next page. Nokia was the first to bring through the 3G smartphone, but the ecosystem in this case was all about content, and they didn't come through with a solution which met the requirements within the ecosystem. So effectively, whilst they were the first, it was an empty race that they won. Philips were the first to bring through high-definition televisions, but the filming companies and transmission companies had not yet moved over to high definition, so it was a failure for them. Sony brought out the e-reader well in advance of the Kindle, but again, that product brought through new players into the ecosystem, and again in this case it was about content, and the Kindle was the first one to really crack the content and the access to the books. So if we look at the Michelin run flat tyres, I think everyone would agree it's a great idea. It was a run flat tyre, it brought added safety. In other words, if you had a puncture, it would be a safe puncture, and it would enable you to drive, I think, something like 70 miles until you found the service station that would change your tyre. And because of this, and the way it was designed, it enabled car manufacturers to no longer put in a fifth tyre. So it had added space. The idea was great, but what they did was they underestimated the ecosystem. So the original ecosystem was from Michelin supplying to the car manufacturers and to the dealerships. And this they got right when they did the new tyre. But the new ecosystem brought in new partners. In this case, the added partner who was very critical in this value chain were the service centres, because to change the tyre required different machinery, and the investment of the service centres to invest into that new machinery was not high enough to justify them to do this. So whilst Michelin got it right with the car manufacturers and dealerships, in reality when people bought the cars and then they had their flat and they took it to service centres, the majority of service centres hadn't moved over to the new machinery required. They were therefore unable to change that tyre, and worse still, you couldn't just change one tyre, run one normal tyre with 3 run flat tyres. So people with flat tyres were actually having to change all 4 tyres to a regular tyre. It was a colossal failure for them, even though the product itself was great. And here's a good example of where we talk about that ecosystem. I now look at a case where Schneider operates even today, which is with electric vehicles. Again, it's a great idea. It's energy efficient, it's green, it's sustainable energy. It has backing from various different governments, lobbyists. Very few people would deny the positivity about electric vehicles. But there are a number of ecosystem challenges that we face. So, who are the players and what are those challenges? We have the car manufacturers, the battery manufacturers, the management of the electrical grid and the stability of that, charging manufacturers, the electrical utilities, charging centres, infrastructure and government. I'm sure there are more. And the challenge is to actually encourage people to buy the cars. You have the cost of the vehicle, which is typically high when you consider the cost of the battery. Then there's the resale value issue of the battery, effectively the declining value. There's the cost per mile, and then there's also the concern from people about the maximum journey coverage that you can have. There's also an EV plug alliance, so that different car manufacturers will use common charging systems. The same as we just take for granted when we go into a petrol station. So, interestingly, Schneider is part of this ecosystem. We've recently signed an agreement with BMW to make their electric vehicles over the next electric vehicles, the charging systems and the charging boxes both at home and office for their domestic and fleet customers, and also working on various smart grid initiatives. We've also signed similar deals with Ford, and it'll be a very interesting case to see how this rolls out and how this ecosystem comes to play. My personal feeling is that it requires very, very strong support from governments, and it's going to be a little bit of a chicken and egg situation with gradual growth that we'll see in this market over the next decade. I also now give an example of innovation in my previous company, GET, before it was acquired by Schneider, and this is now a part of the Schneider offer, in fact in the UK and Middle East. It's electrical accessories, it's switches and sockets. There were already metal flat plate manufacturers that sold into the UK for a few years, but it had low market adoption. It was a very, very high cost. It was almost prohibitive. There were range limitations, and there was no retrofit solution. So basically, when you wire a switch or socket into this market, you have a depth of the box, and typically the traditional plates gave you extra wiring space. Flat plate required a whole new redesign of the backs, and no one had yet done that. So the key actors in that ecosystem were the manufacturers, the electrical wholesalers, specifiers, contractors and regulators. Now, we looked at this at GET and we considered that this had to be a very big opportunity for us. And it's an interesting point because we were not the first to the market, but I think we were the first with an effective solution to the market. The range was co-developed with a manufacturing partner in China. We provided the ideation and concepts, some consultancy on the R&D, but the majority of the technical R&D came from them, as they also provided the manufacturing, and we provided the sales and marketing. The range was comprehensive. It had a very wide offer, which solved the electrical contractors' requirements. It was designed so that it was retrofittable, it was cost competitive, and it was a good design. So in doing so, we successfully addressed all the stakeholders in the ecosystem, but we also brought in new ones. And because the range was now cost effective and retrofittable, it opened up the space into the wider DIY sector and also into the wider electrical wholesale sector. And it also appealed to end users to encourage them to trade up their offers because they were able to have a stylish product which was much more competitive for them to have fitted either themselves or through electricians. So I think we've managed to change the market and consumer preference. Those products probably initiated at something like 3,000 or 4,000 plates a month before we came into the market. Within a year we were selling over 250,000 pieces a month. So a very nice margin. So it gives you an idea of what can be done. And here you just see what we did in terms of the range. The top one was the original traditional product onto the market. We then brought through this flat plate version in the middle, and then in fact a couple of years later we had a further development and innovation to change from the screwed version to a more architectural screw-less version. And you see it also just depicting the same thing. I'm now going to give an example of how purchasing functions can drive innovation in your businesses and what I think we need to do. So the example I give is, imagine you have a sourcing team that is able to bring through innovation through some proactive sourcing with key material suppliers. And I'll just list a few of those there. It could be other cases, naturally. So what is the purchasing contribution in this example? In order for the sourcing team to be able to do this, they need to understand their market. They need to understand their products, their customers, their manufacturing, their business, in order to be able to generate the right ideas. But then, once they are able to tap into these different types of technology, the job is only half done. Because then they need to sell this concept within their business. They need to engage all the various stakeholders in their business, which may include R&D, manufacturing, industrialization, quality, and also offer management. So they work with a myriad of different functions, and they need to be able to sell that within their business in order for there to be uptake. Otherwise, I think they will do the first part, and it will be very hard to actually deliver actual innovation. And I've seen quite a few cases in the past where potential innovation has been put forward but not taken up because of working through navigating through the motorways of your own businesses. So some conclusions, and talking about how purchasing can add value. So I've mentioned that we cannot escape performance and cost management. That's here to stay. Negotiations and competitive shopping will remain critical. Quality value engineering, QVE as we call it, I think will be even more important for companies that are sourcing and manufacturing products in China, given the fact that China costs are likely to still be increasing. There comes a point where you're going to have diminishing returns if you just keep on trying to go through a traditional negotiation model. So QVE, looking at different materials, substituting, I think is a great way to keep driving productivity and also quality. Sourcing sections should also be the leader of the rebalancing of the supply in developing countries. This involves supplier screening, the selection, the negotiation, and the delivery execution. And also to be the leader of the business relationships, internally and externally, being that point of reference when your business is looking for sourcing and co-development opportunities. And then to use this position to really drive innovation and lead co-development in your business. Networking and seeking opportunities with external partners to enrich your offers. Providing alternatives to traditional make or develop in-house options. And also taking a strategic and early role in the innovation, including the design and selection of the product. I've tried to challenge the concept of a purchasing team just being given a sourcing or product spec and going out and executing that. I believe that sourcing parts of businesses should really understand what is available from suppliers, what are their technologies, and trying to shape that also into your business innovation roadmaps. So, summary and key points. Cost management alone is clearly not enough. Businesses desire innovation. There's an expectation to boost competitiveness by bringing through innovation, and an acceptance that we cannot do everything alone. Purchasing functions can leverage this innovation and technologies from the ecosystem, from our network of suppliers. And when we do, we need to understand the co-development benefits and risks in order to make good decisions and to manage that co-development process well. Purchasing functions should therefore contribute very strongly, and this will be a very key strategic part of our contribution to lead innovation and also to take the lead on co-development. Thank you very much. Forgive my voice, by the way, because I happened to lose it in last week and it's just happened to come back in the last few days.
I was going to say something.
My wife was delighted.
Gary, thanks very much. I was busy scribbling down a lot of different notes there. Just want to go back. I mean, obviously, innovation. Innovation is really a big driver these days. You're sitting here, International Sourcing VP for Schneider. Are you really, truly seeing innovation coming from this region, coming out of China?
Okay, good question. The answer is yes. And when I think of the value proposition of suppliers here, one of the things that brings a value to us, in fact, is that the local manufacturers in China have increased their R&D competencies. If I go back, say, 10 or 15 years, I would say traditionally they had an industrialization expertise. They could copy anything, and therefore they could subcontract anything. But today, they actually have a creative edge. And I think we're going to see more and more of this coming through from China, where when you deal with, obviously with different levels, but more and more manufacturers here have developed a creative edge to their R&D. So I believe the answer is yes. I don't think it's at the end of the road yet, but there are definitely technologies, and incidentally not only from China, because I focused a little bit on China here, but I think it's a global comment, that certainly there are businesses that are leaders in technologies, particularly the breadth of technologies, that we cannot do everything in-house.
Now, just moving on to code development. It sounds really good, code development and moving along and getting the right partners. But is it really easy to execute? I mean, you go and talk to your manufacturing partner and say, guys, we're now going to code develop. I've spoken to a lot of sourcing companies over the years, and I think a lot of people said, yeah, we're going to really look at this. Is it a reality?
Okay. I think it is, and I think different businesses have different levels of maturity with which they successfully co-develop. And my point when I talked earlier about the delivery risk kind of goes into that area. I think we should not be naive when we co-develop, because you're not, it's not a given that it's going to necessarily bring in what you need. But what I find is that, particularly when I look at a breadth of offers, that we cannot do everything ourselves, that there are companies that have those technologies already. And it's those companies that bring that value proposition in order for us to co-develop. And then I think, in terms of the strategy, businesses wish to co-develop. They wish to at least tap into innovation from externally, otherwise our capital costs, our R&D centres would just explode. So we are able to tap into that. Then we need to walk the walk as opposed to just talk the talk. And that requires a very strong execution, and also why I talked earlier about not only does it require good experience within your project teams, but also there's a mindset where some manufacturers come from might have a DNA which is very much about wanting to manufacture everything in-house, and is a different type of project manager and buyer and engineer that works in co-development compared to your typical R&D person.
But is it easy to go to those manufacturers and say, guys, we want you to share some of the costs with us, we want you to look at the R&D, the concepts, the ideas, manufacture? I mean, do you get welcomed with open arms?
Usually better than when I come home at night to see my wife.
But that's at 3 a.m., Gary.
That's the reason. Yeah. I think it really depends. I think if you're, for example, if you're in electronic land and you're dealing with EMS, PCBA suppliers, you will work in complete transparency with them. That is their business model. But typically I would find that they don't necessarily bring the R&D creativity that you may find in another company. All right? So I think it can, there's many different answers to that question.
Okay. Actually, that's a very good point, isn't it? Working in complete transparency. Ladies and gentlemen, I've got a few other questions, but I'm cognizant of the fact that we have a big audience here. Does anyone have any comments, questions? Okay, Olivier?
Yes, Gary.
By the way, he's a competitor of mine. No, I'm not going to give you cost transparency.
Very detailed question. Two questions. The first one is, for what, in terms of co-development, China is strong? Where
that China is?
China is strong. Is it innovation? Is it cost reduction? Where can you make co-development process efficient? And after, from a very practical point of view, co-development is basically two teams working together. Like you said, in our standard manufacturer DNA, it's not as easy as that to manage communication, to manage cultural gap. How do you manage it?
Okay, so we can co-develop, certainly in terms of cost, and I think most companies which are already sourcing product here, even if it is straight private label or subcontracting type of business, are co-developing, because they're co-developing the manufacturing in this particular case. I think in our industry, which is electrical, I know we're both seeing more companies which are developing an R&D flair. It's not necessarily as strong as the global businesses, but there is definitely a technical competence which is being seen in those companies. And particularly when we find ourselves going into non-core products of our businesses, I find if you were to ask your R&D centre, could they make this product, which is not one of your products today, they probably could develop it. It might take them 5 years. It might cost an enormous amount. My feeling is that we can tap into companies that already have that speciality and technology within their R&D centres to bring in either finished goods or particular technology bricks to bring into our office. So that's how I would look to co-develop in that case. Remind me your second question. My memory's not so good these days.
The second question is, how do you manage cross-culture and communication?
Yeah. I think that if there was one critical thing, it is about your project team. From a sourcing perspective, it requires very strong partner selection, including your partners and seeing what experience they have had in their own track record of co-development. And typically, where you can, continuing developments with those key partners. You don't want to have millions and millions of suppliers. But then within your own team, for example, I have one of my colleagues here today, Frankie Choi, who is a specialist in driving co-developments. Okay, so they have that experience and background and the different approach that you would need in doing co-development. Now, we have a project management, like a PMP within Schneider, which is focused, I'll say, on manufacturing project management. We have a different form of project management, which is more versatile and agile, I would say, when we are working with partners.
Okay. Thanks, Gary. Moving straight along, we've got a couple of other questions. If you don't mind stating your name and the company you represent. Dom.
It's Dominic Jeffrey from Ben Digital. Gary, thanks for that. Can you give us an insight, and it's probably a thorny subject or complicated subject, but how you manage the IP side of co-development when you're asking partners to potentially come up with disruptive technologies? Are you locked in for a long time together commercially, or how do you deal with that?
Okay. So, again, this is a very important area for purchasing and sourcing functions to lead. And I really do believe it does need to be them, as opposed to, say, marketing or strategy leaders in your business or R&D. Because at the very outset, when you're dealing with a manufacturing partner or technology partner, your strongest negotiation position is early on. So that is the point that you need to kind of shape the discussion. And in doing so, being very open that you need some form of contract agreement. So we have, I'd say, a standard contract template. I try to make it as pragmatic as possible and as fair as possible. There's no point having contracts which are so one-sided to your own company that your partner will never sign up to it. And then you end up in some form of spiral and perhaps even going ahead without a contract. So for me, there is a rule that we don't proceed unless we have a strong contract. The majority of that work is effectively done up front on our side because we've come up with a template through our experience of working with those companies. And then you need to have strong IP clauses within that contract. And depending on the technology, and I'm talking again about being pragmatic, there will be different areas that you will either fight for or concede. We have some cases where we may own either the industrial design or the finished product, but the specific technology brick belongs to the supplier. The source code may still belong to the supplier. Other cases where we do a complete white paper form of co-development, where we may own 100% of that intellectual property. And again, that would be something which would be negotiated in the contract at the outset. And doing so at the very beginning, as I say, is critical to be able to achieve that.
Gary, perhaps one final thought, one final question. I've got time for one final question.
Thank you, Christophe Degois, President of the Sourcing Committee of the French Chamber. First, I'd like to thank for your introduction note about the work being put in this event. That's very nice of you, and thank you for joining us. Given that the sourcing environment is changing like never before, I was wondering whether this co-development concept, how does it impact your ability to be very flexible on your sourcing footprint, to be able to change region of sourcing, maybe countries? That's a question that would be interesting to get your experience on.
Okay.
Thank you.
Whether it's about a co-development or sourcing generally, I am not obsessed with having buyers at the manufacturing centre. So if I think of our business, I think it's actually more important for our buyers to be very close to the offer marketing people. That's where they're very close to the business. Okay. So structurally, whilst you need to have different local people wherever the manufacturing is, I think it's important to have your buyers very, very close to the business. So, sorry, you're going to have to repeat your...
In terms of the partnerships with the co-development,
Yeah. Okay, so
is it easy to move around? Because once you're locked in with, once you're locked in with doing the co-development, there's probably less flexibility, and I think that's what Christophe is driving at.
If you do go through, whether it's whatever form of co-development, whether it's a very deep form of co-development, even if it's brand labelling, you are naturally signing up to some form of loose marriage, or as we would use the phrase, a jockey and a horse. And the two of you together will be stronger as opposed to apart. So, yes, if you are, particularly on an OEM type of development, one of the challenges, I'd say, when you're buying, unlike maybe people here that are going to be in the apparel business, which I know is a more fashionable type of product and it changes very regularly, if you have an item which has a long life, it is more challenging to be able to move from one supplier to another, which is why the selection of that supplier and the relationship management with that supplier is absolutely critical.
Okay. Gary, final point. China, the tagline, looking beyond China. Are you, Schneider Electric, are you guys still, are you still looking at China, or are you really now starting to look elsewhere?
Okay. We're doing both. I'd say in the region that I operate, China is a very fertile ground for being able to tap into co-development opportunities. So China, Taiwan, Hong Kong.
So those more mature markets.
These are great areas for us. We try also to develop manufacturing bases which are close to the local markets. So if I think of India, which is another very big area for us, we're developing our own factories and co-development supplies in India. It makes a lot more sense, for example, particularly when you take into account customs and tax and shipping, to be manufacturing in China to India. So I'd say China remains a growth area, and we will continue to grow in this region, but we are also having growth in other areas as well, which are closer to the markets.
Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking Gary Newman.